Well, why can't I can see my slide? I can't see myself. I guess that's okay, but
Well, we can see you, but not your slides.
oh. You cannot see my slides. Hold on. You still can't see the slides?
No,
Let me start over again.
there we go.
You say so.
We, can you press the button from the beginning?
Yes.
Right there where your cursor is.
All right.
There you go.
There we go. Okay.
And if you can, the display settings,
What do you want me to do?
hit that, yes, I think that'll work.
Am I okay now?
Not yet. Did you click? There you go.
All right. Thank you. Okay, everybody, good afternoon. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes thanking everyone for what I think has been a very successful conference. And this is to those who have made the conference possible. Let me just start. Of course, Jorge Perez Lopez, who we always thank at every conference. He's been around since the beginning of ASCE. If he hasn't done all the programs, he's certainly done everything since I joined in '97, and he probably did them before then. And of course, he also edits our Cuban in Transition book. This would not be possible without him. So Jorge, I don't know if you're out there, but thank you so much. Larry, of course, who you were having to see him all through the conference, the social media hound. But he's managed all our ASCE social media programs this year. And that's very important because once we stopped having our in-person meetings, we really had to revamp everything. And Larry's been key to that. He keeps us on the air during the conference and he registered everybody for this conference. I can tell you that he has been working nonstop for at least the last week, maybe much longer, in helping us make this possible. Sylvia Nielsen, God almighty, our treasurer. She's also key to our registration program because we needed to pay our bills. We decided this time to charge. And so we had to coordinate between had you paid and had Larry registered you. And it took 2 steps for everybody and it kept us all going quite late at night. Frank Martinez. Frank is off to graduate school, but despite that, he's actually been managing our social media technical side really from over a year. Most of our practice sessions, he's coached. He's taught all of us how to use Zoom, among other things, and he's managed our website. He did a fairly major update on the website a year ago, and that is progress process of continuing. A newest member of our team, Yolene Maliga. Now, this is neat. I think this is really neat. Yolene is Cuban, but she lives in Vietnam. And so as she's helped our conference and helped us do things, she's been working all through the night. And I could not be more grateful to her. She's been key to helping many of you register when there was some confusion of how to do so. She's been updating our mailing list. That should change in the next month or so. You'll start getting mailings directly from ASCE. You don't have to do everything with Sylvia. And hopefully we'll get those up to date. And she's taking over restructuring our website, which is beginning to look more reasonable and up to date. Lorenzo Perez, what can I say about Lorenzo? He's our secretary. He publishes Happenings, which is the replacement of our what was it called? Our clippings. Now that Joaquin Peugeot is retired. That's been going out to everybody. That will end up just going out to members in the next month or two as a benefit for you, our members. And I personally trust Lorenzo all the time for good sound advice. He's my sounding board. He's the one that cautions me. I'm just very grateful. Sylvia Pedraza, of course, our past president, our current vice president. She's had a lot of other things going on this past month, but she's been a continuous source of information, good advice, contacts, and I've been very grateful for her help. Did I leave somebody off? Yeah, I don't see the slide, but among other people I wanted to thank was our all our panel chairs. If I come up with that slide later, I'll show it. The panel chairs are key to everything that's going on. They help in many cases choose the panels, they organize the panels, they set the agenda. I don't get involved in the panels at all if I can help it, except anything I'm running. So when a panel's a success, a lot, of course, depends on the participants, but also on our panel chairs. And I wish I knew where that slide went. But thank you all for that. Coming up, we will have more webinars. Now, Natalia is going to do part 2 of her series on the problems with investment in Cuba. This is actually going to be a live retreat in Miami. I think it's September, but I'm not sure it's date set yet. And they're going to film it, and then we will put it on our website and maybe just advertise it to everybody. Pavel Vidal wants to do a session in September, October on the Terreo Ordenamiento. I don't know how quite far along he's gotten, but we're looking forward to it. And in that same vein, Carmelo and Omar and maybe Jorge Dominguez will want to do something, the new legislation on small and medium companies. That time has not been set yet. It can't be set until the government actually publishes the decrees and we can read them. Early next year, after the National Assembly meeting in January, if that's when it's going to take place, we may have another mini conference. I haven't told Larry this. He's squeal with pain. Probably not as big as this one, but a really good chance to review everything that's going on, what's new coming out of the National Assembly, and seeing where Cuba is at. Now, that's still an early thinking. I've not discussed it with the board. They may shoot me. If there's a new change in president at the beginning of the year, you know why. Late winter or maybe early spring, still in planning, the Cuban Studies Institute at FIU, Jorge Duane's group, is planning on having a conference on Cuba. They had one 2 or 3 years ago. I forget exactly when. We had 1 or 2 panels, I think, from ASCE, and which did very well. And we hope to participate this year. I will be appointing a coordinator very soon to sort of help work that out and organize it. And that, well, COVID-19 permitting, that would be live if it happens. Then we have a business meeting coming up in September. All are invited. Everybody's invited. Anybody who is a paid member or who has registered for this conference is invited. It's a great opportunity for members to tell the board what we are doing wrong. I think it's important to know what we do wrong before we know we do right. And then suggestions for new directions. We are in an organization in a very dramatic transition. Many of our older members who have been around since 1990 are retiring, and a few have dropped dead on us, which wasn't very nice of them. We're looking for new members. We are searching out. We're going to get new leadership as time goes on. And I think even if we go back to our annual meetings, we're obviously, our social media program has become very important. I don't have the numbers yet, but we have a lot of visitors from Cuba this time. And we're going to want to reach out to more of them. So these are things we need to discuss. Our board discusses them regularly, but there we go. There are some of my thank yous. But we can use all of your help. So let me go back and thank again some of the rest of it. I said our panel chairs. I thanked everybody now, but did a great job. All of our board and officers. Not everybody worked directly on this conference, but they've helped us all through the year. We have very good board meetings. Everybody contributes. We get a lot of help. A couple people that definitely deserve mention. Jorge Escarol and Juan Sanchez. As we work to have an in-person meeting this year, they put a lot of time and effort into it. It didn't work in the end, but that wasn't their fault. And I really was appreciated their help. And Jorge, and I think Tawan as well, will be very key in working up our live in-person conference next year, which we will sponsor along with the FIU Law School, probably in September. And we expect a very good audience. We get a lot of law school students and maybe some undergraduates from FIU. And they're going to help pay the bill. We'll discuss that at the business meeting, but two key people who are going to be very important all year long. Of course, the other members of the board, Manuel Villon, Mario, who does a lot of work in agriculture, even though he's not chairing it this year. Carlos Sigli, a former president, source of great advice. Elena Solo, who's been working on COVID projects all year. Just got her name in the Miami Herald, I think, is telling people what to do and what not to do. And Jose de la Torre. And they're not in the board, but Enrique Pumar has been very helpful in getting our publications thing going again on the website. So all these people, again, I want to say thank you. And I'm going to shut up, let the panel begin.
Should we start?
Well, thank you very, very much, Gary. And we, as one of the thank people, we thank you very much. And it's time for the next panel. Jorge, it's all yours.
Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to the Cuban Political Economy Challenges panel. And first of all, let me start off by returning the thanks to Gary Maybarduck, who has done yeoman's work on the board and leading us through some difficult times and doing so very gracefully and successfully. I also want to welcome our panelists for this afternoon's panel. We have three distinguished guests. I will introduce them briefly at the beginning and then say just a word or two when they come to present their papers. We have a slight order change. We'll go in the order of Professor Gabilondo, Jose Gabilondo, Vadim Grishin, and then Larry Katab-Backer as our third panelist. We do have the Q&A function that all the participants have access to, so you don't have to wait to put in your question. If you have a question, put it into the Q&A queue. And when we get to that point, I will read out the questions and direct them to the panelists, either to the panel in general or to people in particular. To do the introductions, let me start off by, so you can follow along. 1 second. Okay, great. So our first panelist is Jose Gabilondo, my colleague at FIU Law School, who teaches financial law. And before joining the academy, he worked at the U.S. Department of Treasury and the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. In his work, Professor Gabilondo argues for the full recognition of Cuba's sovereignty, independent of U.S. designs on regime change. Our second panelist is Vadim Grishin. He's an adjunct professor at George Washington University and Georgetown University. He has extensive experience working with the Bretton Woods institutions. He was the board member of the World Bank Group, served as senior advisor at the International Monetary Fund and consultant at the International Finance Corporation. He's also visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Professor Grishin graduated from Georgetown University, the McDonough School of Business, and holds a PhD in social sciences. And our third panelist is Professor Larry Kata-Barker. He's a member of the Coalition for Peace and Ethics. He holds a faculty appointment at Penn State University School of Law and of International Affairs. He teaches in the areas of corporate, constitutional, and international law, and he is a scholar of contemporary Marxist-Leninist theory, China and Cuba. And among his other work, he's published articles on Cuba's constitution and a book on Cuba's political ideology entitled Cuba's Caribbean Marxism in 2018. He's currently working on Cuba's engagement with China's Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, folks, so to kick it off, we have Professor Gabilondo, and let me just say very quickly about his paper. The brief abstract is conventional, and that means opportunistic. Interpretation is that Cuba's current social turmoil overlooked the extent to which it reflects the success of US regime change policies, and two, a typical response to the structural adjustment programs promoted for other countries by the IMF, the World Bank, and the US. Professor Gabilondo.
Thanks so much. Can you see my, I think you have to let me share my screen.
Larry, I hear you mumbling to yourself because you're still muted.
I believe that you can. I'll say, let me just. Now you should be able to host.
Who can share? Okay. Okay, so now let's see. Okay. I still, let's see, I can't seem to share my screen.
All right, that's kind of odd. You have host privileges.
I think I'm going to have to leave.
Oh, he's frozen.
Jose's not on the panelist list. He's on the participant list.
Yeah, well, he was on my panelist list, but now he's gone. So he'll be back in a second, hopefully. And we can try this again. Again, apologies, folks. There he is.
There he is. Yeah.
It says
Okay.
unable to start video because the host has stopped it.
Well, you should be able to go now.
Okay, I think now there we go.
Hooray.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
All right. 20 minutes? Is that the time, 20 minutes?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, well, thanks so much to ASCE. I always like this conference. It's very valuable. Let's see. Let me start with my standing goals whenever I do any kind of scholarship about Cuba. I see my work as countering knowledge gaps about Cuba produced by diaspora capture of US policy and the politicization of Cuban area studies. And I generally, what I want to do is I want to recognize Cuba's existing sovereignty under public international law and apply a conventional standard of review to government policy. And in my work, I try to suggest the outlines of a post-Castro approach to sovereignty that in this case involves economic experimentation with market forces and a more complete repudiation of Soviet era mechanisms. Now, I think that account of what's going on is as plausible as any other account, and maybe more so. And it has the strategic value of beginning to represent Cuba in ways that will perhaps protect it from being treated punitively as an ongoing artifact of the Castro regime. I'm sorry, there we go. So there are three questions that interest me here. Is the reform the kind of structural adjustment program promoted by the IMF and the Washington Consensus? Two, what does the reform say about the future of post-Castro socialism and its approach to political economy? And three, does the reform say anything about how to allocate blame for Cuba's economic problems between US sanctions and external constraint and Cuban central planning? And let me make some tentative conclusions. I think the tarea, and I'm particularly focused on el ordenamiento monetario, the most recent one that began really in December of last year and began in earnest this January, has a lot of conventional structural adjustment elements: export promotion, import substitution, devaluation, austerity measures. But it's quite distinctive for several reasons. It's imposed voluntarily. It has an exceptional scope because of the size of the devaluation and because of how deeply monetary policy was insinuated into every aspect of the economy. And it's being done without the palliative financing from international organizations. In general, I think the reform deserves more praise than it has received. Now, I see it primarily as another chapter in the de-Sovietization of Cuba post-Castro. It suggests that Cuba is able to adapt on its own terms. And I really see the tarea as relating back to a series of policy measures begun in the 90s during the El Periodo Especial, which I think still continues officially. And I think it may signal a more institutionalized rather than a personalized philosophy. In general, I think the reform has a lot of iconoclastic virtue because it's not an orthodox intervention, but I don't think it's fully appreciated, and I'd like to address that. So I'll very briefly go over the background. I think I'm just going to mention the Sovietization of the economy because the terms of trade that CAME used to subsidize Cuba by buying nickel and rice at a premium over market and selling oil at a discount, I think of that as the original sin in many ways in Cuba's economy in terms of administrative pricing, cartel pricing, because even after the separation from the Soviet Union, that form of administrative pricing continued. And that's what the tarea has fundamentally ended with. What happened during the special period? Well, it was the beginning of a liberalization. It didn't go as far as it might have. But one of the things that happens in the 90s is I think there are initiatives in Cuba to impose sound cash management and treasury management. There's a law in 1999 that imposes a unitary account, a single account, like a general fund to manage country treasury management. That's something the IMF recommends. And I think it's an example of a cadre of economists and financiers in the government who for a very long time have been trying to rationalize public finances. We know what led to the reforms. I think there has been a shift post-Castro in lots of ways. There's also been an intensification of US sanctions. And in a way, Cuba was already in structural adjustment mode. It has been for a very long time. It's had very scarce foreign exchange. Its ability to pay for imports has contracted, as other people have noted. What I saw as the central problem that the Tarea was trying to address was the very strange monetary situation. Cuba had no money. It had at least 3 currencies, but no money. The conventional definition of what money is something that serves as a unit of account to measure a medium of exchange and a store of value. I would add a 4th element for international money, which is that there be a market which generates an observable rate for foreign exchange transactions. Cuba didn't have any of that. It had the national peso, the official unit of account. It had this dollar proxy, and it had the dollar, which in many ways was the currency of choice, although it came with lots of baggage. And what I saw is the main problem in terms of governmental accounting was the fact that they had multiple policy exchange rates. There was an official Cadeca rate of about 1 to 24. It's kind of a market rate insofar as Cuba has markets. And then there was the default rate used by the state, which I think of as it's really like a through the looking glass monetary identity, that 1 kook was equal to a koop was equal to $1. That was the default rate. But the most deforming part of the economy was not that default rate, because you could convert that easily enough. But it's the fact that there were all these different policy rates that were used to convert kook and koop at different amounts. And the example that's been given, and I think it's the most important one, is the way the monetary identity of 1 kook equals 1 koop equals $1 distorted trade. And it really is, the way I see it, it's inspired by and a copy of the old CAME pricing, the cartel pricing that had subsidized Cuba. And so that's an example where that's a legacy of the Soviet period that the Tarea breaks with. So, and the way it works is if you were an importer, you were given $1 worth of purchasing power in exchange for a peso. So let's say rice costs 500 a ton on the world market. The importer pays only 500 national pesos. He's getting a large subsidy, and the rice enters the retail economy at the subsidized peso price. Exporters had the opposite problem. They were credited only a 1 national peso for $1 worth of export earnings. And what this did is, and again, it's something that Cuba could do, because I think of in Cuba, the state is like Shiva. It's the creator and destroyer of markets. And because it makes these markets, and it situated itself as a central Forex broker, standing in the middle of all Forex transactions, capturing a kind of arbitrage profit and allocating it for its purposes. So what did the Tarea do? It did a lot of things. It retired the kook. It fixed a conversion rate, which is the same as the standing rate. It redesignated all accounts and assets into koop. First, there was a 6-month period that's now been extended for a year to exchange kooks. It adopted a single koop dollar rate, which is an improvement over the variety of special policy rates that were used internally. So when we talk about the devaluation, what we mean is the devaluation of the peso only in official accounts, only in the official sector, to match what the street sector was, which as it was probably undervalued or overvalued anyways, based on what we've learned about the the parallel market. It seems to be a fixed rate system, and future devaluations are likely. The government has said they want to reduce subsidy. They no longer want to subsidize products. They want to subsidize people. And as part of that, they also increased wages, pensions, and welfare transfers. It's really a word that they use a lot, transversal reform, because monetary policy had become such a structural part of the economy overall. Now, this is in many ways the exponent, and I think it was the architect in many ways of La Tarea, Marino Murillo Jorge. He's often on Mesa Redonda. He leads the commission on the implementation of the lineamientos. He's a member of the Politburo. I find him really interesting. I think he's a very interesting person to watch. I think he's a new kind of Cuban economic official. He's very technocratic. He's very intellectually engaged. I always get a kick out of hearing him because he describes the things that are going on in the economy. And he always says, "Qué interesante, es muy interesante." And I just think, I think that's interesante. I mean, I think he experiences this as working in a financial laboratory. Cuba is in many ways a laboratory of aberrant economics. And so he's in the middle of all this. And I've been very, very impressed by him as a transitional figure in terms of the market updating of Cuban socialism. Now, I noticed something very interesting, which is from December of last year to July 11th, when the protests started in earnest. In his public presentations, he focused almost really exclusively on internal affairs. He recognized the defects of Cuban central planning consistently, loudly, across the board. And that really got my attention, because there was no blaming of capitalism or the embargo or US hegemony. And I thought, boy, that's interesting because of the omission of that routine part of the Cuban discourse. So I found that very interesting. Now, unfortunately, that all changed as of July 11th. And as of July 11th, his Twitter feed, has now adopted more of the standard Cuban discourse about, of deflecting domestic responsibility for some of its economy. So I found that interesting. Now, why is he important? Well, I really think he embodies a form of transculturation, as referring to Fernando Ortiz's notion of hybridity, because he consistently advocates for native approaches to Cuba's microeconomic problems rather than off-the-rack approaches that have been used in other countries. I find that interesting and worthwhile. Again, he consistently recognizes the domestic failures of economic policy. And I haven't heard him mention Adam Smith, but he's always praising what is essentially the invisible hand, the ability of markets to self-adjust. He's very, I see him as someone who's committed to markets without the triumphalism of a lot of other market proponents. And one of the most interesting things that he has said, and I think it's one of the most noteworthy parts of the Tarea, is he basically has restated the revolution's equality norm to acknowledge and justify inequality based on differential contributions. That's very interesting. So he's basically said it's okay for someone to earn more and have more if they are contributing more. That's very different from to each according to their need. It's really to each according to their contribution. And so I find that very interesting. So my overall conclusion about it is structural adjustment. Again, and many of you worked at the IMF, you're very familiar with it, but basically conditionality programs were programs that the IMF would require as a condition for borrowing money from the IMF. And they would target the structure of the state and public expenditure. They were much reviled, universally reviled, especially in Latin America. So much so that in the after the crisis, people began to talk about sort of a kinder, a gentler IMF that was more flexible about adjustment. And there was a comment with Christine Lagarde where she was asked about structural adjustment, and her reaction was something when she was IMF president, she's like, oh, we don't do that anymore. That's not true. They still do that. But there was a move on the part of the IMF to distance itself from the most unpopular parts of structural adjustment. Now, again, I think it's very unique that what Cuba is doing, because it's voluntary. It's unrequited in the sense that they're not getting anything for it, and it's unenforceable. There's no, in other structural adjustment programs, you have the fund looming over a country with the threat of punishment. Here, you have only the will of Cuban officials. I'm running out of time, but there are a few more points that I want to make. So why I think this matters is because we should interpret much of the protests as a quite routine reaction to structural adjustment programs, again, which are universally reviled. And in many ways, the reform is doing what US regime change policy has tried to do for so long and hasn't been able to. Now, I think the reform is important. I was surprised to hear the assertion yesterday that the reform wasn't that important and things were structurally the same as before. There have been so many fine papers in ASCE over the years criticizing the very features that have been abolished, that conclusion frankly surprised me. Now, here's what I think is significant about the reform. I think the most important thing is what it does to intragovernmental accounting. Yesterday, Pavel Vidal talked about the transparency shock created by these methods. Now, these changes, now that won't be obvious to the outside world. It's still, but in the black box of Cuban economic planning, there is a shock because they've pulled back the monetary veil and they're making costs and revenues more explicit. We were talking about the law of one price yesterday, the fact that the Cuban market doesn't have one, but the reform tries to put sort of a law of one price or one exchange rate into the internal state market. I think that's important. Another important thing, people have talked about the enterprises, the state enterprises, the simulation that was done last year showing that several hundred state enterprises were operating at a loss. Murillo, when he was talking about that, what he said was very interesting. Basically what they're doing is, and it's an accounting shift, is they are now reifying business loss as an accounting entity. In other words, instead of lumping in loss as a feature of lots of businesses, they're singling out losses. And he used a phrase I'd never heard, positivizar la pérdida, which I understood to sort of dignify the loss as an accounting item, making it real, and that's how, and contributing to the transparency shock. So that's a set of important things. And that's why I think this relates back to efforts from the 90s to impose sounder treasury management practices. I think it's very significant in monetary policy because it makes monetary policy in Cuba look more conventional without having its hand in every aspect of the economy. And it also eliminates the kook as a policy instrument that the government has that it can use on a discretionary basis. I think the most important part of the reform is its attempts to improve the price system, to work better at signaling. And hyperinflation is a sign probably that the system is working as intended and better internalizing the real costs of things. Again, and I think part of the importance of the reform is discursive, in particular, restating the equality norm by providing a socialist rationale for inequality. That's noteworthy. Another thing that has become that Murillo talks about, and I think is very important, I haven't heard it before, is the relationship between price and quality. And it really is like the beginning of the foundations of consumer expectations that would discriminate between price and quality, saying, well, if something's a better quality, you're going to pay more for that. So I see some of this as severing doctrinal ties to Marxist-Leninism. The wider significance, I think this is part of the state's differentiation between public on budget and enterprises off budget, which is part of the financial desegregation of the state. And I think I'm in my last minute. So, and I actually think that the government, if the government survives these series of changes, and I think it will demonstrate resilience, and it will be a sign of a more institutionally differentiated government rather than, you know, the Fidel Castro's sort of autumn of the patriarch approach. I don't think the protests change global goodwill. And again, I think they illustrate the continuing failure of US regime change. Well, my last thing is I do think that the challenge will be in state enterprises, creating a change in management culture, evaluating state enterprises on a standalone basis rather than a consolidated way, sorting enterprises based on their profitability, creating a culture of accepting business failure. So anyway, these are the challenges ahead, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose, very much. Next, we have Vadim Grishin, whose paper is entitled The Eighth Congress of the CPC, Continuity versus Reform. And the pithy short description of it is, what can we find reading between the lines of depressing, tedious, and voluminous Congress documents? Professor Grishin. If you could please unmute yourself, sorry.
Okay, and Larry, I would like to ask you to help me with the PowerPoint also. So good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor and pleasure to participate in this panel with such excellent experts as Jose and Larry under the leadership of Jorge. And thank you, Mr. Esquero, for your kind introduction. And again, my apologies. Larry will help me with the PowerPoint presentation. Previous panel discussions have shown that real life in Cuba has been overshadowed by what should to be an epochal event in the island's modern history, the 8th Congress of the Communist Party. The Congress held in April did not even suggest occurrence of the street protest of July. It seems that no one there expected such manifestations would be likely in Cuba, even though the long delay exchange rate unification reform was launched by the authorities during the emerging COVID pandemic in the island, when it seemed were easier to control mass reactions that might result from painful changes introduced. It turned out to be the opposite. People went out to protest because of goods shortages, delay with massive vaccination, and ever-increasing level of inflation, compounded by negative GDP growth and the overall growing hardships of sanctions. All those factors turned a perfect storm and impacted the well-being of Cuban society, reflecting the loss of public confidence that the government can improve matters. The protest confirmed that despite 62 years of communist tyranny, Cuban society is very much alive. Let me go back to those events a little bit later, after a brief analysis of the 8th CPC Congress. Next slide, please. Those of us who lived under the communist regime, not necessarily in Cuba, I was born and grew up in the USSR, know that the most important results of communist congresses amount to little more than new appointments and reshuffles in leadership and an ability to read depressingly tedious and voluminous Congress documents between the lines. What do we see if we apply such criteria to the outcomes of the 8th Party Congress? First, the 8th Congress was marked by, I quote, a conclusion of the process of orderly transfer of major responsibilities from a historic generation to a new one, end of quotation. From my perspective, despite the formal appointment of Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel as new first secretary of the Communist Party, it is too early to definitely judge the long-term results of a succession process. Raul Castro, without holding officially any leading position, has remained the most influential political figure in Havana. And the new 40-member Politburo has continued to be dominated by hardliners that have supported political continuity and rejected any idea of political and economic openings. There had been expectation that Cuba's economic crisis would encourage further economic reforms after the unification of the currency exchange rate in January. But the Party Congress has already dismissed such illusions. An assumption that a more market-oriented group among the Cuban elite, which some experts have associated with current Prime Minister Manuel Marrero Cruz, would strengthen its position and allow the Prime Minister to acquire the post of CPC First Secretary, has now been disproved. However, Mr. Cruz, formerly head of tourism and an employee of Gaviota, the tourism arm of the military, has been promoted to Politburo member. Another newcomer to the Politburo is General Luis Alberto Rodriguez Lopez Callejas, currently under US sanctions. He is presently head of the Armed Forces civilian holding company GAESA that controls large part of the Cuban economy. The growing influence of military business managers is potentially changing the power balances between three main groups of interest: the army, the civil bureaucrats, and the party bosses, in favor of top military officials. Reading between the lines, we can find traces of a struggle between these different factions around some economic issues, particularly related to the private practices of some professionals and full-scale privatization suggestions reflected in Raul Castro's main report to the Congress. Next slide, please. We see here communist practice as usual. One step forward through expansion of permitted self-employment activities from 127 to more than 2,000, accompanied by numerous reservations and caveats. While massive privatization was labeled a threat to Cuba, Raul Castro has proclaimed that eagerness to create high income would sweep away the foundations and essence of a socialist society, end of quote. In this way, however, low income and evenly distributed poverty continues to be the de facto ideal of Cuban socialism, while the communist system in the island has tried without success to eliminate all economic activities for personal gain. Its approach sharply contrasts with the Deng Xiaoping famous slogans, "Let some people get rich first," or "Getting rich is glorious," which triggered a launch of reforms in China. Overall, creating fairs remain an effective tool for the communist elite. Referring to private activities, Raul Castro warned in his report to Congress and to the Cuban population that massive privatization would dismantle affordable public education and healthcare in the short term. Translating these statements from communist bureaucratic jargon to the language of political economy, the Cuban government and the communist plutocracy have concerned about strengthening private entrepreneurship and will continue to steer the commanding heads of the economy, while a nascent private sector remains vulnerable and unprotected. One can also expect corrupt and less efficient ways to emerge in private sector development through latent forms of nomenclatura privatization that could use concepts of ownership diversity, once officially supported by the Congress Commission and now headed by Cuba's Prime Minister. And next slide, please. Bold red lines were also drawn around a state monopoly on foreign trade. Raul Castro in his central report categorically rejected any form of private commercial imports and exports. According to him, the establishment of non-state system of foreign trade would be irreversible and would lead to strategic errors, including the very destruction of socialism and therefore of Cuba's national sovereignty and independence. In the case of Cuba, state monopoly on foreign trade is a mechanism for self-isolation, mandatory planning, control of hard currency flows, and reductions of any entrepreneurial initiatives. The 8th Congress has rebuked the illegal practice of buying items abroad and reselling them in the islands at a very high rate of profit. This, of course, has become a disappointing message to those who had hoped that certain components of the Chinese reformist model would be implemented in Cuba. China's foreign trade system started the transformation from state monopoly to market openness during its initial period of reforms, gradually adopted international trade practices, and through WTO membership in 2001, establishing a foreign trade system compatible to multilateral trade rules. The risks this presented of creating inequality within China and a dependency on capitalist market were outweighed by the potential gains, sizable investments in high-tech transfer and exchange. While manufacturing enterprises in some socialist Eastern European countries were allowed access to foreign market back in the 70s and 80s, Havana rejected the European and Chinese experience, including Deng Xiaoping's political economy in his favorite saying, if you open window for fresh air, you have to expect some flies to blow in. At the same time, Raúl Castro has approved the use of freely convertible currency, the purchase of different products that would last as long as it takes to recover and strengthen the economy and ensure real convertibility of the national currency. The 8th Congress acknowledged that the Cuban economic model presents structural problem and does not provide sufficient incentives for work or innovation. A rather sparse set of solutions, next slide please, offered to add dynamic to process of updating the socialist model and boost the economy by promoting decentralization and autonomy of the local governments and enterprise system and consolidating the country's investment process. What exactly lies behind these general phrases is still hard to predict, but it is obvious that they will inevitably coincide with policies taken by almost all former socialist countries who try to overcome past economic downturns. In most cases, with the exception of China, the effectiveness of those half measures was limited and eventually led to transitional stages of market development. In China, decentralization applied at the very beginning of reforms became a fundamental component that provided economic success. The deteriorating economic situation has forced the communist elite to encourage foreign investment, recognizing it as an important contribution to the performance of the national economy that could eliminate existing obstacles and outdated prejudices. Hoping to introduce new businesses with the participation of foreign capital, particularly in the Mariel Special Developing Zone. The Congress also set a target to shake up the structure of the state enterprise system from top to bottom and vice versa, looking to banish inertia, conformist attitudes, and lack of initiative. It would seem to be a form of wishful thinking adopted by many former socialist countries who have shown us that moral and administrative incentives have limited value. Cuba hasn't escaped the fundamental flows of such economies as expressed in a popular saying, they, the authorities, pretend to pay, and we, the laborers, pretend to work. Both Raúl Castro in his main report and Diaz-Canel in his closing remarks to the Congress didn't promise any acceleration of reforms, but did point to China and Vietnam as successful economic models. Interestingly enough, Raul Castro concluded that shock therapy policies will never be allowed in Cuba. The problem, however, is that the Eighth Congress continues to demonstrate a lack of desire to bring about significant changes or gradual incremental reforms that worked in China and Vietnam. While the government has promised measures to reduce bureaucracy in the agricultural sector, it's still far removed from creating the deep structural changes implemented in China and Vietnam more than 30 years ago. Another important takeaway from the Eighth Congress is its intention to ask the Cuban people to tighten their belts and resist hardships. Raul Castro expressed it in the following way: we must get used to living with what we have and not presuming to spend more than what we are able to generate. To do otherwise is a mistake we have already made and should not repeat. In other words, we have here complete conservative continuity over any idea of significant change that would incentivize development. Despite the socialist bravado about Cuba's rejuvenation and success in national building, the party's ongoing obsession with control and repression reveal a lack of confidence in the system it has configured. And sooner rather than later, the Cuban leadership will face a dilemma again, determining what reform path it should take. Next slide, please. The Sino-Vietnamese model that maintains socialist rhetoric, strict censorship, mechanism of repression, and one-party political system has long attracted sympathy in Havana. At the same time, it's obvious that the Sino-Vietnamese model with a two-track economic transformation, applying quick decollectivization in agriculture and creation of official special economic zones that facilitate a shift to export orientation and intensive integration with global value chain, have become hardly acceptable to the Cuban leadership. By comparison, the Eastern European post-communist model, and our colleague Martin Paulus talked about that experience at the previous panel, includes both a political component with democratization of political life and an economic one with full liberalization of market forces and various forms of European integration into NATO and the EU do not readily conform to the Cuban reality. There are also models that have been tested in post-Soviet republics. For different reasons, they have lost their attractiveness in Cuba, including deeply under-reformed Belarusian authoritarian regime. It has aroused certain sympathies in Havana, but has now begun to fall apart in the eyes of the world. However, I believe that Cuba slowly but surely moving towards such kind of post-Soviet type of authoritarianism with monopolism, etatism, and endemic corruption. At the same time, such kind of post-Soviet transformation should be supported by the third force. In the case of Belarus, that support was provided by Moscow through different types of transfers. The question is, who could be again a lender or supporter of last resort in current situation, an issue discussed yesterday at the first panel. Would China or Russia assist Cuba if the situation in the island deteriorates further? We can't exclude the possibility, but the solution wouldn't lie in economics as much in geopolitics. And for both capitals, Beijing and Moscow, Havana could be again a geopolitical instrument. For China, there is also the temptation of exchanging Cuba for Taiwan as part of new wolf warrior diplomacy promoted by Xi. Russia as well could be interested in balancing its policy in Ukraine. The question is also whether these two powers have resources to carry out such possibilities, and my answer is yes. And very briefly, remarks regarding nationwide unrest in Cuba in July. No doubt that it's a remarkable and very important political event. However, the recent experience of autocratic regimes has shown that even massive demonstrations, as those that took place a year ago in Belarus, can't succeed if a ruling elite is not fragmented. particularly the enforcement agencies. If the security and military are under dictators' control, the regime will survive. Let me stop here, and I will be happy to continue our discussion in Q&A format. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vadim. Our last paper is by Larry Kata-Bacher, and it's entitled The Eighth Congress of the Communist Party of Cuba and the Future of the Cuban Economic Model. Its short description is, let me read. This paper, From the Eighth Congress of the Communist Party of Cuba to the 11th of July protest movement and the future of the Cuban political economic model. The paper takes a deep dive into the documents produced during the 8th Cuban Communist Party Congress to suggest the ideological basis of the failures and errors that may have contributed to the popular protests that erupted on 11th July 2021. Larry?
Well, thank you very, very much. I changed the title a little bit. As I was working through the materials, I remembered that on December 31st, actually right at midnight on January 1st of this year, the Babalaos of Cuba met, as they always do, to give the prognosis for the country. And as it turned out this year, and normally what I do is I spend January 1st working through their reading of the IFA as it applies to Cuba. This year was ironically enough, the year of Olokun. And for those of you who know Afro-Cuban traditions, especially those in this case out of Nigeria, you'll remember that Olokun is one of the major gods who sits at the Orishas, who sits at the bottom of the ocean in a constant rage, the richest of the gods, the god who is confined in his rage, but in the process will destroy things, will set out tsunamis and earthquakes and bring things down. And in a sense, what I plan to do, I'm not going to cover any new ground. There's only so much you can say about that thing that that is called the Eighth Congress. I'm going to reframe, I think, a little bit of what the very interesting points that Vadim and Jose made in their presentations in a slightly different way. I tend to like to work, as some of you know, in the area of ideology and semiotics. And that is how people and collectives think and believe rather than what is true, but what is believed to be true, and on the basis of that belief, which frames a way of thinking. So what the perspective I'm taking is to speak in a sense to the construction and reconstruction of narratives, and in this case of the narratives of political economy as a norm system, as communication, as a political tool, and as a system of taboos that affect the liberal democratic camp just as strongly as it does the Marxist-Leninist camp as it has come to be developed in Cuba. And in the process, I'm going to talk about it in its new aspects. We tend to be dinosaurs, and we like to look at life backwards, but really we're in a very different age. We're in an age of social media. We're in an age in which the narrative itself is more important than the truth, that the stories that one builds around quantifiable measures is more potent than the quantifiable measures themselves, and that narratives built either in forms of discourse or on the bodies of the masses on the streets, or on the nomenclatura in their ceremonial spaces, each play a part in the construction of belief systems, which then form the basis on which we talk about these things that we've been talking about for the last day and a half, as if we're talking about something that's true. And so again, my focus is on the belief systems and its arcs to give us perhaps a little bit more of an insight about what it is that may compel us to believe in certain positions, to believe in the limitations of certain positions, and to understand better the ideologies and the language of the ideologies that tend to limit our abilities really to understand and reach across within ecologies of very different sets of languages. So we're in the world of Olokun. Hopefully we will do a little bit of shaking. And for those of you who find this excruciating, I've put some pictures up that can amuse you while I babble through the rest of the presentation. We start here with a fundamental contradiction. I'm going to be referring a lot to materials that have kind of come into the global popular culture, but have its origins in very, very specific aspects of Maoist Leninism, which has now been naturalized everywhere, from the boardrooms of American companies to the core leadership of the Cuban communist state. And one of them is the notion of fundamental contradiction. And here it's the oppositions that present the current challenges to a vanguard that have to be overcome in their progress towards their ultimate objective. Of course, for the Marxists, the objective is the ultimate establishment of a communist society. For liberal democratic states, it is the construction of the ideal market in an ideal society that is protected in its dynamic interpretation of its customs and traditions. It doesn't matter what it is, but it's the process in a sense that counts. And the Eighth Congress was important in a number of respects. One, for its absolute utter blindness to the rising contradiction that their own theory should have warned them of, as they sat in this kind of self-reflexive and air-conditioned space, congratulating themselves about their ability to survive the transition of the historicos to a new historical era. It was in a way a very religious kind of, for those of you who follow, for example, the institutional politics of the Roman Catholic Church, there was and they really should have been wearing red for any number of reasons. But it really was like a meeting of the magisterium, a renewal of faith, and a faith not just in their ability to move forward, but a faith in their ability to be naughty, that is, to be forward moving. We spent a day and a half talking about this. And of course, from our perspective in the liberal democratic camp, vesting what they did with this extraordinary transformative significance, I'm going to suggest that it was none of those things, but it was very pretty. And it sounded well, but at the same time, it just infuriated the people, the masses that they were supposed to guide. And so what one sees in this thing is, as they are in their building in this performative ceremonial space, the ultimate collision between that development in a building well protected and mass expectations, which were translated in political action, then almost within months blow up into what we see as a very limited, but I believe quite significant explosion. Not significant in a liberal democratic way. I'm going to try to understand its significance from the perspective, the internal perspective of Cuban Marxist-Leninism, and use that as a basis for trying to figure out what it means or how it'll translate into the way in which the leadership of the country endeavors to meet whatever it is they think they're meeting in the future. And so we move from this self-reflexive ceremonials of the Eighth Congress to the explosion of the masses. And we move from the documentation of these proceedings, which I call the embedding of left error. And again, I'm using a Chinese Marxist term, and here it is the deviation of a vanguard party towards an extreme of vanguard self-reflection disconnected from the masses. And at the same time, contrast that with the popular manifestations from the 11th of July, which embodies for the leadership in Cuba the realization of the fear of a rightist error, that is an error within Leninist theory that suggests that the whole point of protests, certainly from the masses, is to overturn the system of vanguard governance and to move back to systems of bourgeois capitalism with or without liberal democracy. And at the end of this, I'm going to suggest that this narrative that's played out both discursively and on the street has a very, very near-term analogy in terms of how this thing is going to play out. Vadim talked about Belarusia. I will talk about Hong Kong in terms of the way in which both the masses explode and the way in which the state and its apparatus will then respond, including the apparatus of the international community, which, by the way, has almost, you can almost check the boxes off and watch them repeat what winds up being absolutely and almost risibly ineffective in the context of Hong Kong. Now apply it to, I'll use the Spanish, sus deberes, in the context of Cuba. So that's what we're going to look at. To do that, there's to look at the Eighth Party Congress in isolation, I think misses the point and misses the extent of its reactionary, and in this case, a leftist reactionary character. And again, I'm reminding you that I'm doing something that may be a little different. I'm analyzing this from not from the comfortable perspective of liberal democracy and what we've been used to on this side of the Straits of Florida, but how one might begin to see this from a critical Marxist perspective. And the reason for that is to get into their heads. We're already bored, and I'm certainly bored out of my head in getting into our heads in the liberal democratic camp. We know what we think, and we're very good at it. What we aren't very good at is getting into the heads of the people that we are now looking at. So here we are, and I think this arc, you can start with the first Congress. It's not necessary except in one respect, which I will get to, but the Fifth Congress really is the nice start of the arc of development, the normative development that gives us all of the economic nightmare headaches that ASCE has been talking about since the late 90s. And that is one, a rejection, and this is a quote from from Fidel Castro's remarks delivered at the Fifth Party Congress. I put it for you in English and Spanish. A rejection of the Chinese model, a suspicion of globalization and global markets as venues of neo-imperialism, of the notion of the state as the only permitted monopoly capitalist. So not a rejection of capitalism, just a rejection of capitalists other than the state, the core of leadership of the state under the guidance of his first secretary. And then all of this, of course, reaffirmed in what had been the Resolución Económica of the time, central planning, strictly managed private sector, even in the context of crisis, and the supplemental and complementary nature of both the non-state section and of markets as a means of allocating resources. That's what we have. And this is at the end, as we're coming to the end of the special period, that's the template. Well, this template, of course, and certainly those of us in the West went giddy with the Sixth Party Congress. Oh goodness, we're going to have movement. This is, and of course, the Chinese and Vietnamese model. Here was that instantaneous, that moment that lasted less than an instant. In the Sixth Party Congress, Raul Castro is coming. He's going to set his mark. We all know this. We've talked this to death as well. It's supposed to be a transitional moment. The lineamientos, for an instance, showed us a glimpse of a Marxist-Leninist Cuba, which was very distinct from what had come before, and then what was ultimately crushed in the Seventh Party Congress. Right, the development of the lineamientos, and then the movement towards a revision of Cuban Leninism that appeared, again, China was off limit, but appeared to be more open to something a little bit more hybrid. And by the six-party Congress, we got a sense that, well, this is going to be tolerated, but there are going to be limits. And the limits, of course, are the limits that are set out, the lines in the sand that we saw draw in the fifth-party Congress. You avoid the Chinese model. We continue to be suspicious of markets. The entire non-state sector is viewed as an experiment that is going to be subject to constant review and modification. They're going to manage self-sufficiency, always under the control of the state and its apparatus, and always limited where it appears to the leadership. This is a political question when it appears to the leadership, and Vadim did a great job of noting this principle when it contradicts the fundamental line of Cuban socialism, whatever that means by the core of leadership, right? The forward thrust of the lineamientos were then blunted but not stopped in the Sixth Congress, and it opened the door. The liberal democratic camp went crazy. We saw the opening to the United States. Less often discussed is the significant opening by the Europeans, which remains in the form of the Cuba-EU political dialogue and cooperation agreement, which was signed actually at the time of the Seventh Congress, but really was a product of and a reward for what appeared to be forward movement of the Sixth. Well, the revolution of the Sixth Congress was undone by the counter-revolution of the Seventh, right? And here again, a reaction from the left. When we move from the lineamientos and the sensibilities, the kind of more mass line, open textured engagement of the lineamientos to the conceptualización del modelo político económico model, and in a sense back to the sensibilities of the Fifth Congress. And this was underscored by the Plan Nacional de Desarrollo Económico y Social 2030 de Cuba, with its 6 guiding themes. I did a paper once where I suggested you could take the entire Plan Económico 2030 and reduce it to a set of interlocking analytics that produces an algorithm that, if the Cubans were clever enough, could be used as a big data substitute, both for central planning and for market allocations. Of course, no one there is either clever enough, nor do I suspect they have enough computing power to do this, but the mindset was there. And again, a return to the rationalization of planning as a substitute for markets, and of markets as a supplementary mechanism with respect to which we are suspicious but tolerate, especially in times of crisis. Well, that continues in the Eighth Party Congress, and what winds up happening here, I guess I've got how much time do I have left, Jorge?
You have until 3:29.
3:20 now. Oh my goodness! All right, so I'll hop through this. I'm not going to go through the Eighth Congress. Vadim and Jorge did a great job of summarizing it. But what was remarkable about the Eighth Congress, beyond what was already said, was its extraordinary blindness and stasis. It's a Congress that is occurring in the middle of COVID. It's a Congress in which the Cubans are seeing the disasters all around them, in which people are whispering in their ears about things, and with respect to which, but outside of the Congress, remarkably, there are the appearance, right, narratives of changes with relatively little effect. All of this occurring and within a congressional space in which what becomes the central issue, the central celebration, is the ability to survive the vagaries of age and death of leaders, rather than the things, including the effects on the masses that are going on. So from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, the bells are ringing. But of course, from the perspective of Soviet nomenclatura thinking, no one hears bells, and there's no windows in these air-conditioned buildings to look out and see what the masses are up to. And besides, they can, as we know, can be controlled, right? And Vadim, of course, and I put up the same quote that Vadim referred to as well, but I do it in the form of a contradiction. On the one hand, right, Raul talks about the need to overcome traditional ways of thinking to shift the mentality of the state and its workers in order to defend the increase in national production, including food to banish harmful habit, all of the stuff that you heard in the 6th Congress. And then without missing a beat, we have the sentence that Vadim quotes, because the two of them come at the same time. So on the one hand, this is 1 step forward and 2 steps back, without ceasing to aspire and work for the highest levels of satisfaction of our needs. We have to get used to living with what we have and not expect to spend more. Easy to say inside the leadership core. It is not playing well in Santiago de Cuba or in Holguin. And so what we wind up seeing again is a focus on party building, on the management of mass organizations, and on the character and pace of reform. Raul did spend a bit of time criticizing that, but he'd been doing that almost consistently since 2010. So for most people, that was almost noise. You know, we've heard this before. It's almost he's just got a macro criticizing everyone for their slowness in moving the lineamientos forward. But it was party building and the management of mass organizations, which is the self-reflective exercise, Leninism without the masses, that was the movement, right? And with that, I've got just a couple minutes, if you'll indulge me, right? The response of the masses was dramatic and immediate. This is, of course, in Havana. Right, and what I want to do is got just a couple minutes and way too many slides. I found this enormously engaging blog out of Cuba it's the Comunistas blog, which had one of the most dispassionate but yet internal and veiled to some extent. I'm going to criticize a little more the handling of the July 11th protest from the perspective of the responsibilities of a Leninist vanguard. And it provides, I think, a really good perspective for figuring out the way in which the internal dialogue about what went right and what went wrong, or what is going wrong within Cuba, what is open to the possibilities and what is off the table, I think were nicely set out. Right, and the 9 points are very simple. The protest did not include significant counter-revolutionary elements. They have to grudgingly accept the fact that what we're looking at, and from a state still committed to the Leninist concept of class struggle, this is a significant one, that we're not dealing with right error, even though that's built into the narrative. What we're dealing with is non-counter-revolutionary mass actions, and that poses an existential crisis to the state. And indeed, the second point is, because of that, the character, the protests have diminished the political legitimacy of the state apparatus. So all of this self-congratulation of the 8th Party Congress, right, is essentially eliminated. Its value becomes eliminated on the streets of Holguin and Santiago de Cuba. The protests originated in the working class neighborhoods, from which a Marxist perspective suggests a contradiction between the policies of the vanguard and their responses on the street. This is classic class struggle, in which the erroneous element is the vanguard itself. It's a warning, one that doesn't seem to be listened to, but a warning, not from the perspective of the Americans, but from the internal logic of the Marxist system itself. And the protests may not represent majority popular opinion, but Leninism teaches us that it's a minority vanguard, right? The leading forces of the masses of society that tends to overturn things. And so that's the hidden criticism there. It's noticeable by the absence of socialist slogan. And that's critical too. So the party building that the 8th Congress is talking about is here criticized as effectively a null set. It's not working. Something else has to be substituted beyond providing food and medicine and the like. Now, this minority of workers is allied with the minority of the intellectuals. That's a conceit. The connection between the San Isidro movement and the worker protest is not to be underestimated. It is one thing, and this is the problem in Hong Kong, it was one thing to put a bunch of bodies on the street as a discursive performance. It's another thing to give it narrative weight, and for that you need the intellectuals, especially the intellectuals with bridges abroad. And the fact that it may have been a minority is irrelevant if that minority is actually tied to the vanguard of worker mass protests. And indeed, even worse, it's the lumpen proletariat. This is criticism coming in from Cuba. It's the lumpen proletariat that played a significant role. Here, the state is actually in trouble. Now, having said that, they also noted that because of the nature of this weakness, it provided the perfect opportunity for the leadership's fears to be realized. Because when you have a mass Leninist movement against the purported and now illegitimate or challenging the legitimacy of the Leninist official vanguard, you create the appropriate setting where the quote unquote, I'm using the Chinese term, the black hand of foreign interference can then hijack the process and undermine the state. And in this context, of course, as Lenin teaches us, it's violence that is the currency that will make or break the effort. And when you look at it from that perspective, you can understand why it is both that the Eighth Party Congress was as big a disaster as it appears, even with its rhetorics and its performances of at least formal change, and the potencies, the potential potency, even within a Marxist-Leninist structure, the potency of the mass protests that occurred on July 11th. Not from the perspective of the liberal democratic camp's 70-year-old hope for the transition to liberal democracy. No. The narrative here, which makes this really potent, is the way in which the leadership itself and its reforms, as phlegmatic as they are, will be undermined by a Leninist revolution rather than by a liberal democratic one. There's a Hong Kong example. My time is up. And it suggests, again, this gap between the vanguard and the needs of the masses is going to continue to be a very explosive factor X, which will continue to make the vanguard's position to be very, very fluid and fragile. That's a traditional depiction of Olokun. Sorry, I went a little over, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. These papers work very well together and speak to each other tons. We have some questions on the board. If you have additional questions, please write them in. You click on the Q&A icon and then just write them in, and I will read them out. So let's start. So the first one is from Lorenzo Perez. It says, Jose, I believe you gave too much of a pass to the implementation of the ordenamiento. Given the restrictions to private activities, the devaluation has not generated a supply response. There continues to be a wide dispersion between the official exchange rate and the rate in the parallel market. The dollar is probably king in Cuba, and exchange rate subsidies to the state enterprise have apparently been substituted by subsidies in the budget. The latter is more transparent, but what are they going to do at the end of the year with these enterprises?
Lorenzo, those are excellent. It's actually like a multitude of excellent questions and issues in a paragraph, and I want to take them apart one by one. I don't know that I gave too much of a pass, but I think I consciously tried to judge the ordenamiento on its own terms, on what it purported to do. And I think that responds to this feeling that I have sometimes when we talk about Cuba. I think my feelings of fair play sometimes are offended, because I think when we talk about Cuban bureaucrats, we rule out ex ante all kinds of we automatically conclude. And so I think that's why maybe a bit I play the devil's advocate. But Murillo, he said something very interesting early on, and he said, this is not going to increase the size of the pie. We are talking about redistributing an existing pie. There will be no allocative gain from this immediately from this process. And I understand your supply question as related to that. Is there more national income? He said there wouldn't be. So going into it, I think conceding that means you don't judge the reform as a policy measure based on supply conditions. Yesterday, several folks said the supply conditions weren't there before and they're not there now. And I know there have been some marginal changes in terms of liberalization of jobs, but so that's why I don't think that's not a defect that I would criticize the reform for. In terms of the your final point about the fact that what used to be off-budget subsidies are now going to become formal on-budget subsidies for state enterprises, I think that's an improvement, and I think that goes to the transparency shock that Pablo Vidal talked about yesterday, because I think it's different if there's a group of people sitting at a table and you're all looking at the same accounts and you're looking at those same numbers, which can no longer be denied or hidden behind those weird exchange rates. And again, that's something that Murillo admitted to that. He said, for the first year we will socialize the losses. But I do think that's an improvement. In terms of your comment about the parallel markets, I thought that was a very interesting exchange yesterday when Rafael and Gabriel were talking about what has changed. I would assume that this current arrangement is better if you have if you will, like a consolidated parallel market, and then you have the official market, because that makes the contrast and the comparison more obvious. The difference between, I think, the rates that Gabriel was talking, that Rafael was talking about yesterday were as much as 70, 70 to 1, 70 coup to 1, not 24. So I think that contributes to transparency, if you will, even in the black market, that the structure of the black market matters. And maybe the black market can even become a kind of policy instrument for the central bank, in that it's like a futures market or something. Like it tells you, what the value would really be if you opened up the process. I wanted to share that. I guess that was all. If you have more thoughts, I'm and again, I think the dollar, it will always be a dollarized economy, and I think that's just a function of financial gravity, given how close it is to the United States. That's how I see it.
Thank you. The next question is from Yvonne Grenier, and it's a compound question. May I ask what Vadim and Jose think of each other's main points? And then for Larry, what does he expect for the 9th Congress? So I will, I guess, allow Jose and Vadim to interpret what what each other's main points are, and then react.
Okay, let me start. Great points. These efforts by Larry to penetrate in their Marxist jargon and all this shadow interpretation of Congress discussions, because they are not so evident, not only for public, but also for experts. So a great job, and it's necessary to have great patience and to work with this language, with this specific kind of mentality, and try to understand what the real reading can be of this. Again, it's necessary to read between the lines and try to understand the motivation and outcome of this. So great job. And let me also respond to the question about next Congress, though it's addressed to Larry. I believe that it could be potentially even more, much more important than previous one, because the 7th and 8th transitional Congresses, and the next one could be with the new leadership, post-Castro Congress, in full and real term of this reality. So that's why we can speculate. No one knows exactly, but I believe that next Congress could be much more interesting than the previous, the recent one. And a couple of words about parallel markets, shadow black economy. It's negative for economy. It's negative. It's wrong impulses, signals to the market. It's corruption. It's administrative measures. So, guys, I'm not so optimistic that this shift from state monopoly to shadow, black, and other colors of parallel markets is a good sign, because it's a way to the corrupt transformation in Cuba. And we could see these examples in former socialist countries. Nothing good. So it's a bad way of nomenclatura transformation of this socialist monopolism to a bad version of with integration subcomponents of market. Thank you very much.
Well, I really liked Vadim's presentation, and it was so helpful translationally, because those are extremely hard documents to get through. In terms of just reading the language and understanding the concepts. So I found it very helpful. I understood that one of his main points was that, you know, when you go through all the obfuscating language, the hardliners still have a stranglehold on the discourse and on within the elites in the elite system. They have a stranglehold. And so they can effectively keep anything from happening. They can keep anything from happening. And I guess I have to concede that, because I see some change, but it's glacial. It's really very glacial change. So, you know, I would have to agree with Vadim on that. He had a really nice slide where he classified all the different transition models. There was the Sino-Vietnamese and the Eastern European one, and then the FSU one, and again I wonder, would I put Cuba in that? I hesitate, because Cuba, again, this is why I think I like Marino Murillo Jorge. He's really focused on a Cuban approach to all of this, because Cuba seems different from all three of those situations. The one that I think it's most like, and I think Vadim said this, is the Sino-Vietnamese one. And I think that's because, even though Vadim was talking about elites, there really is, I think, a non-elite core of people who believe in some version of Cuban socialism, even among the protesters. So, and I think that wasn't the case necessarily with the former Soviet republics, and I don't know enough about the other ones. So I do think even within the masses, within the mass, you know, there is a, they're not neoliberals. And they're not sanguine, in part because they've felt the lash of the United States in a way that these other former republics, you know, didn't. So I think they know firsthand the hardship of the neoliberal system, and so I think that's why there's some kind of non-elite commitment to revolutionary values. So thank you.
All right, I can answer the last question, the Ninth Party Congress, and I'll do it in this way. Question number one. Is there going to be a Ninth Party Congress? Or is there going to be a long period of time between Congresses? We've had regularity over the last several Congresses, but there were periods where there was a significant amount of time between them. So that would be question number one. Point number two, I think that the way in which the non-Marxist world has finally sort of caught up with the 20-year-old version of a Chinese Marxism, Chinese markets Marxism, is both it's behind the times, and to the extent that that is what is hoped for, it remains absolutely off the table in Cuba. Maybe Vietnam, but Vietnam is also a very, very different place, although the ties between China and Vietnam are growing. And there may be some amount of movement, some discussion. And again, it's a matter of trust. They'll trust the Vietnamese certainly more than they'll trust the Chinese. On the other hand, if what we're talking about is new era Chinese Marxist-Leninism, then perhaps there may be something in there for the Cubans, and precisely for the reasons that everyone in the liberal democratic camp finds unacceptable within the movement of now Chinese Leninism away from its Xi Jinping reform and opening up era to one of more significant control, but worse, because there's not significant control in the old-fashioned Soviet way. Again, it's a problem of thinking backwards. It's control that the Chinese have been pioneering over the last 10 years, which is grounded in data-driven algorithmic governance. It's not for nothing that the Chinese have been paying attention to the way in which Western markets are now effectively algorithmically driven. One can theorize this: if you've got enough firepower, enough computing power, and enough theoretical capacity, one can generalize this, which is precisely what they're doing in the social sector with the social credit regimes, in the judicial sector with the quantification of judicial decisions. And as they have already told us, they don't hide any of this stuff in the regulation of what would be post-market economies. And to the extent now the Cubans don't have the capacity to do this, but it will certainly be inspiring. But beyond that, again, the fundamental contradiction that the Ninth Congress is going to have to face, and it's a huge one, which was nicely evidenced physically with the eruption of the 11th of July, is the fundamental gulf between the aspirations of the proletariat masses and the mandarins sitting in, again, those air-conditioned buildings in Havana. The nomenclatura, as they might recall, with the exception of Belarusia, now find themselves having to actually work for a living as leaders of political parties and of large enterprises all over what was left of the eastern end of the Soviet Empire.
Thank you. The next question is from Luis. Will the deepening economic crisis and popular insatisfaction increase or lower the fear of markets by the Cuban Politburo?
Let me start also. It's not about fears or happiness to embrace market. It's the reality which dictate. And sentiments are less important. But I believe that under pressure, there is no other option. So only next step to the market. So this post-market reality about which Larry told us, I believe it's still a little bit of fantasy. It's a long-term prospect. But currently, there is only one way to introduce more market components. And it's not about the sentiments of the members of Politburo. And we can see it, Jose, by the way, also the evolution, such kind of evolution in all post-Soviet socialist countries. And this is generic. It's not something special for Cuba. This transition happened, and Cuba is still developing in socialist cycle. It's we can compare the current stage of Cuban development with Gorbachev, perestroika period, initial stage of Gorbachev. So, and there are a lot of similarities what they're trying to do, actually, including at the level of state enterprises. But efficiency of these measures are very, very limited. That's why I believe that they should go further on this market transformation of Cuba, regardless of their sentiments.
Anyone else want to say something about that?
I love markets. The Cubans will continue to be extraordinarily suspicious of markets. I think that there is no movement from the notion that markets can and must remain managed, control, supplemental and complementary to the backbone of the political economy of Cuba, which is grounded in centrally planned state-owned enterprises and the control by the vanguard of the significant and sensitive means of production, including people.
If I can insert myself for a minute. First of all, Jose, you, I don't know if you saw Mark Frank's presentation to ASCE, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. Mark Frank, the Reuters reporter.
I've seen a few of his. I don't remember which one, but
well, he did a half glass, half empty, half full presentation. He was our guest speaker. And much like you, I think he saw the glass as half full rather than half empty. My view, I've followed Larry's views for a long time. In fact, I've written a lot of papers that are very similar to his. And I too have actually gone through various party Congress documents word by word. It's an interesting task. It reminds me, it wasn't as bad as sitting in Havana and having to read Grama every day or dissecting Fidel's 7-hour speeches. But it's quite a challenge. But I'm changing my views a little bit. I think that this current crisis is so serious and really has no prospect of getting better anytime soon, that it's going to force changes regardless of ideology, regardless of the prism that Larry talks about, the way people see issues. Survival becomes important at some point. I don't think they'd be doing the reforms they are now if they didn't foresee it. And the fact that they are responding and changing is brought out in, with time as they see that things aren't working. I think is going to lead to fairly significant changes, which then the party will have to sort of how to rationalize.
I think Gary froze. While we wait for Gary to unfreeze, let me take up another question. Roger Bencor says to Jose, is the economy dollarized when you can't receive transfers in dollars from abroad?
Roger, that is such an excellent question. And when I read the question, I realized, oh, I think I now have to agree with the proponents from yesterday who were arguing for the fact that little has changed, because I think I would say the following. Cuba didn't have money, as we understand it, before the reform, and it still doesn't. For the reason that you say. I think it's I guess it's dollarized in terms of the dollar is the unit of account. It still functions as a unit of account, but that's only one of the functions that money has to serve in order to be money. So I guess I would have to qualify what I was saying. And I think I want to turn back to Vadim's excellent. I want to ask him something, because I really appreciate your perspective in terms of putting Cuba in the context of maybe a fairly universal development in socialist countries. But my question is, Vadim, do you see things? Do you see any things that are unique in Cuba that you didn't have in these other situations? And I don't know about them, but my sense is that especially in monetary affairs, Cuba it's so originally pathological that was different from what happened. But maybe that's not true. Maybe other maybe former Soviet republics also had these strange monetary arrangements?
Oh, thank you very much for this question. It's silent. This is maybe the main difference between, if we compare it with other former socialist countries. Monetary, yes, there are some specific features, but in general, you can't change basic rules of monetary life, and financial life. Yeah, you can adjust, you can try to create something artificial, isolated, but with limited capacity to replace it. Even China is trying to create now a new currency and a new financial system, but it's very, very challenging and complicated. It's not easy, if possible. And it's impossible for Cuba to create something unique, specific, which can exclude it from main trends which sooner or later develop in the financial monetary sphere and area. So that's why, again, I believe that, and I agree with Gary, that under such pressure, it would be necessary to make some steps and choose instruments which are limited. They are well known and they were tested in other countries. So they can't invent something that changed dramatically the way of development of Cuba with the limited resources, limited capacity to innovate. And this is my response, that I see more similarities. The glass is half full than it's half empty. And these similarities are closer to former socialist countries than to even to many Latin American economies, because the essence of Cuban economy is still socialist economy. And it's very, very different from neighboring countries. That's why the experience of former socialist countries could be very valuable in analysis what we can expect, what may happen in Cuba, and actually to understand better what's happening now. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate that. Let me ask you a question. I agree with you. The island is a very material factor. Is proximity to the United States a factor? Because none of the other former socialist environments had that.
A huge factor, sure. And Cuban American community, it's a big conversation for many, many panels, how it can work actually in this situation. A huge capacity, huge potential to invent and develop perfect transition. I agree, having this huge human, financial, technological resources just 90 miles from the island, yes, if they find the way to adopt it. And it's not only about economy, it's about politics, it's about ideology, it's about tradition, and a lot of other stuff which should be discussed, how we can imagine this unification of nation, because nation currently is divided.
Yeah.
So, but again, it's a huge conversation which we continue, I strongly believe, based on the new events which we will see in the island.
Gary, you froze. Do you want to finish your thought now that you're back?
I forgot where I was, but I just wanted again to say, I think this was a great presentation, and I think that it should continue and your writing should continue. I hope to see you in lots of other ASCE conferences. I think you add an awful lot to the understanding of what's going on, even when you differ. You add a lot of understanding. I know that we have some US government officials watching today. I've been working on that for a long time to get them involved. I also know we have some Cuban government officials watching. Most of them haven't put their identification on. So I think this is great. Thank you.
So before we say goodbye, we probably want to maybe answer Arturo and Felipe's questions.
Sure, I can read them both in succession, and then whoever wants to take them up. So Arturo's question is, Larry, one area that was not covered in your presentation was the blurring of class lines that involves how the offspring and relatives of top officials are significantly connected to market structures adopted after the Six-Party Congress in 2011. Some of them are utilizing their political connections to build market-oriented businesses. Do you see any reflection from the party about how to co-opt these groups or the implications of these trends for state civil society relations? And then the last question is, beyond the immediate, by Felipe Mantega, beyond the immediate, is there any way to accelerate the transition towards a more rational and equitable national framework?
All right. Arturo's question is both subtle, sensitive, and also dangerous, but well worth asking. And rather than answering it directly, I will tell an apocryphal story which I know is not true. One day, the heads of the largest industries, privatized industries in Russia, were invited to the Kremlin. And this occurred after the head of the largest group, that petroleum company, had been humiliated. Even though he won a victory with the European Court of Human Rights, he was essentially destroyed, although not so much that he couldn't live comfortably, but he was not a billionaire anymore. And the apocryphal, which I'm sure is not true story, then goes on and says, as they sat in his office, the richest people in Russia, there were only two words that were uttered by the Russian leader, and that was 50%, at which point everyone was invited to leave. So that's the story. And that story may resonate with the question. The other story is the story of the family of princes in China, who for a generation had been running some of the largest basic industries in Shanxi province, who all of a sudden found themselves going from the position of untouchable to complete and utter ruin as a warning to everyone else. All right, so part of those stories remind us that one of the great difficulties of vanguard systems is their inability to carefully control the development of class systems in their nomenclatura. The Soviets, of course, were the prime European example. The Chinese had their own problems, and they may still, but it is something that, if not controlled, can be quite disastrous. The second thing is, and I think this is the dangerous part of the question, is that sometimes that can also be used as a sword that cuts through ideological reticence to push through reform. If in fact reform is impossible from the bottom up because you can't get enough hairdressers and shoemakers in Cuba to get their views known, it may be the desires and practices and changes in the perspectives of the elite that will drive reform forward, which will then, as was mentioned, I think in one of the earlier comments, will then require an after the fact revisions of the system. And so there's a conundrum here for foreigners who are looking either for regime change or who are looking for market opening. On the one hand, you're going to have to deal with corruption. On the other hand, that kind of systemic problem in places like Cuba can actually be used effectively. And from the Cuban perspective, of course, the more outsiders use it effectively, the easier it will be for the discipline and supervision committees of Leninist systems like this to find and discipline those people. And so it'll cut in a variety of different ways. But yes, the point is I think well taken. 2011 and the habits of those who are well placed within Cuban political and economic society are well known. But in light of the ideological conundrums posed by the 11th of July and the way in which the Biden administration is looking more and more like the Trump administration without the tweeting, it may pose some difficulties as well.
Anybody else wanted to add something?
Well, Luis had a comment about hyperinflation.
Yes, so hyperinflation is undermining the Cuban peso. There is a large stock of dollars in Cuba, plus flow of euros, Canadian dollars, yen as attractive alternatives. Reactions? Larry, technically we have until what time does this panel end?
Well, you had mentioned that we started at 2:15. We can go as late as 4:15 if you like, if there's interest in discussion, or I know some people may have thought that the panel ended at 4, so it's completely up to you. I'm happy to continue the conversation for a few more minutes or not, as you like, and as our attendees like as well. I note, and this is Felipe Mantega's comments, one of the most interesting things about our discussion is, again, when you're looking at this from the perspective of narrative conceits that tend to be unconscious, is the kind of elephant in the room, and that is the acceptance of both the inevitability and the centrality of notions of transition, right? Sometimes when there's a crisis, the system is not the issue, but the ability to use systemic mechanisms to meet and overcome the challenge becomes the central issue. But here, and certainly from the perspective of the West since 1959, the issue, the narrative has always been framed with transition in the center, which has been used sometimes as a positive mechanism, sometimes as a negative one, sometimes as an explanatory one, and sometimes as a way of shaping both the analytics and those taboo areas around which one cannot speak, including a lot of what I was speaking to. And I did that in a sense deliberately, just to remind the audience about how easy it is in venues like this to cross taboos and to use discursive approaches that, how do the Americans say it? Oh, that make people uncomfortable, or that become impossible to respond to. And one of them is the notion of transition. It's clear that Cuba is in crisis. It's clear that the state is going to have to meet it one way or another. It's less clear whether the issue is one of the way in which the state is constituted and the identity of its elites, as it is about the way in which they utilize whatever it is that they have and whatever narratives give them comfort to actually meet the needs, which can be measured not by the happiness or unhappiness of Europeans or the American administration, but by the by the reaction of the people in Cuba. For a generation or so, it's been very easy to quantify that reaction to a low-level crisis. You can measure it in everything from immigration rates to rates of money coming in, and now you can scrape social media. You can do all kinds of things, but that's the quantifiable measure. To the extent that the state believes that they can ignore this, the state is merely making it inevitable for a particular type of transition to occur. I think though if the state is sensitive enough to this, they will get in front of it. Unfortunately, the history of European Marxist-Leninist states sort of suggests, as Vadim kind of made very clear, that European Marxist-Leninist organizations are notoriously bad at getting in front of issues, especially when the issues are issues that come up from what at least officially was a now eliminated proletariat. And so for Cuba, when you look at transitions, it's important to be sensitive to the way in which you're using that term and the context in which you're using it. Monetary transition, economic transition, social transition, civil and political transitions. They're all related, but they're not necessarily the same thing, nor are they inevitably connected in a particular and singular way.
Well, as a final kind of, if there's some more questions, but as a final moderator's prerogative, I also wanted to take a stab out of like putting together the three pieces that I think speak to each other very well. In terms of kind of one of the questions we had before were like the main points of each of the parts. And so a big thing is how the perspective we have both on the tarea ordenamiento and on the street protest and how these things come together in terms of a change or crisis or transition or what have you, in a moment in which it feels that things are in movement and somehow. And so one way of characterizing it is kind of seeing it the way that Jose presented it as a kind of IMF-like type of structural adjustment program that was taking course kind of on its own through sort of the interworkings of Murillo and the economists and experts within the Cuban thing. And then the question of what impact does the street, if you have that perspective on it, what impact do the street protests have on that? It might seem actually to make it retrench, to make those kind of reformist movements go underground. And basically then have Murillo come out and speak whatever, the more generic rhetoric, maybe since the whole thing is under threat, the criticism is out there, then all the criticism just has to be denied and there's no room for space. It's almost kind of the autopoiesis idea of Cuba. Everything within the revolution, nothing outside of it. When things are happening within the revolution, but it's taken up as an external critique, it blocks it. That idea. And then versus Vadim's idea of sort of what the progression is, the different models, the Chinese one, the kind of Eastern European one, and the former Soviet republics one, of this kind of gradual shift into this kind of nomenclatura capitalism, or parallel markets, in which what's happening is really just an adjustment of state enterprises maybe competing against each other and leaving the old system of subsidies, which is the wacky exchange rate thing, but not giving up on that because there's still the idea of equality or what have you, the idea that free trade and very unequal positions of power won't be permitted. Whether that's pretextual or not, maybe it's just sort of rhetoric to get to the ultimate goal, which is, crony state capitalism, which is really where we're headed, not toward any IMF movement, but no, we're moving toward crony state capitalism. And then the kind of the open question again of, well, what did the street protest have, to what kind of impact does it have? And then I think Larry's thing becomes very important because he's sort of talking about the fluidity of how all this is interpreted and narrated, and possible coalitions of, people on the ground, at least in their discourse, and maybe some section of the vanguard. So the indeterminacy of the interpretations, both Jose's movement and Vadim's movement, and actually that this actually is a moment of indeterminacy in which maybe both of these things could happen. It could go more one way versus another, depending on the coalition of these forces and their, sort of discursive concoctions into which way they move forward or not. And so this is sort of just a framing to try to put the two pieces together. And I think it is a very interesting thing to think about what the likelihood of those kind of coalitions, relative coalitions. You can also imagine coalitions of the históricos and the the ones that are just all about, within the revolution, everything, versus this other kind of, segment of the vanguard plus people on the street type of thing, and that the relative forces there. Thank you, everyone. It was a great panel. Thank you for the panelists for the presentations.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Don't
Thank
forget
you. Night.
the evening session.